Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This is about the cost of becoming who you are, not in the motivational sense, but in the quiet, disorienting aftermath of self-recognition. It begins where most success stories end, in the moment you realize that what you've built inside no longer fits the choreography of who you used to be. This isn't about ambition, it's about inheritance. The subtle contracts we sign with our past selves, our families, our cultures, the agreements that say, grow, but don't change too much. Succeed, but don't become unrecognizable. At its core is the question, what if the real fear isn't failure, but becoming someone your world no longer knows how to love? The fear that surfaces in moments of growth isn't always resistance, it's loyalty. A fidelity to earlier roles that once protected you. Sometimes it's not fear of who you might become, but grief for who might no longer come with you. The shadows mistaken for doubt are often grief in disguise. Not because you're broken, but because you're intact enough to feel the dissonance between who you were and who you're becoming. And that grief is not abstract. It has names, faces, whole lifetimes. It's the part of you that whispers, if I grow, will they still see me? These thresholds are not linear. They ripple through relationships, memories, and embodied histories. To change is not just to evolve. It is to disturb a field that once held you in place. And in that disturbance, something sacred and irreversible begins. The emergence of a coherence that no longer needs to be explained. Not louder, not clearer, just more real. And the moment you feel it is the moment you realize becoming isn't the risk. Staying untrue is. You say you want more, but every time it gets close, you flinch. That flinch isn't laziness. It's not even fear. It's loyalty to an older version of yourself that once had to stay small to stay safe. Carl Jung would call it a shadow revolt, but Karen Barod might see it differently, not as revolt, but as residue. In this light, your desire and your hesitation aren't opposites. They're entangled, threads of identity pulled, taut through the body's memory, the culture's pressure, and a childhood's unspoken rules. You want to rise, you've always wanted to rise, but rising means breaking character. It means walking off the stage of the person you've spent years perfecting, the one who didn't ask for too much, didn't take up too much space, the one who made others feel comfortable by dimming their light. Invisibility isn't just a coping strategy, it's a lineage. You learn to associate ambition with danger, not from textbooks, but from glances, silences, the way joy made someone in the room wince. And now success doesn't just feel ambitious, it feels disloyal. Hannah Arendt might say that the private self is refusing to step into the public realm of action, not because it doubts its ideas, but because it remembers the cost of being seen. The psyche isn't protecting you from failure, it's protecting the emotional ecosystem that raised you, the one that taught you to survive, not shine. So when you find yourself self-sabotaging, hesitating, holding back the sentence you know would shift the room, you're not weak, you're faithful. Faithful to an emotional contract you never signed but learned to enforce. I won't be more than they were. I won't speak louder than they could. I won't succeed if it means being alone. These are not thoughts, they are architecture. And that architecture doesn't dismantle itself just because you read the right book or watch the right video. It crumbles slowly, through grief, through disorientation, through the long silence after you do the brave thing and nobody claps. And yet, something else begins to stir. A new nervous system. A body no longer shaped around guilt. A voice that doesn't need to be understood to keep speaking. A presence not dictated by trauma's choreography. Maybe this is what Jung meant by individuation, not becoming your best self, but becoming a self that no longer betrays its own expansion. Not just choosing success, but grieving who you were never meant to stay. You think the test is in what you do, but the real test is in what you permit. Not to others, but to yourself. There's a difference between permission and permission slip. One is internal, the other waits to be signed. And most of us, somewhere deep down, are still waiting for someone older, for someone hurt, for someone gone, to nod, to approve, to say, yes, you may become who you are. Until then, we rehearse instead of live. We repeat instead of risk. We hover above our own lives like ghost editors, making safe cuts before the scene is even shot. That's not because we lack ambition. It's because our ambition was quietly made conditional, Be brilliant but not too loud. Be visible but not threatening. Be honest but not disloyal. It's the kind of psychological contract Jung spent his life trying to map, the quiet tether between the self we dream of and the selves we've loved who didn't get there. It's not survivor's guilt. It's successor's guilt, a preemptive grief for the moment you look back and realise you've outgrown not just your hometown, but the entire emotional weather pattern that raised you. Barad would call this a diffraction, where becoming is not linear but split by the invisible forces around us. We don't evolve in a vacuum. We don't ascend by ourselves. Every step forward changes the relational field. Who you become isn't just about you. It's about what that becoming does to your context. And if your context can't hold it, part of you starts to disassemble the dream just enough to keep things balanced. This is why so many of us don't fail. We ghost. We unbecome. We scale down the frequency of our own calling just enough to blend back into the landscape of what's familiar. Arendt might say that action requires appearance, and appearance requires risk. Not the risk of loss, but the risk of no longer being who others expect you to be. That's the real vertigo of success, not the fear that you'll fail, but the certainty that you'll change. And once you change, so does the story your parents held, the story your friends expected, the story even you used to need, because it gave you a role to play when the world felt unsafe. So the test isn't can I do it, it's am I ready to lose what won't follow me there? Most aren't. Not because they're weak, but because they still love the people, places, and parts of themselves that success might leave behind. There's a particular silence that comes before a breakthrough. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of disorientation. You feel it when you've said the true thing out loud and no one knows how to meet it. When you finally show up in a way that breaks the choreography of who you were and the room doesn't clap, it just changes, subtly, imperceptibly, maybe even forever. That silence, it isn't failure. It's the moment before the new language arrives. Jung called this the symbolic death, the disintegration of the persona before something authentic can emerge. But symbolic doesn't mean painless, it means invisible to others, but fully real to you. This is where most people turn back, not in the big dramatic collapses, but in the quiet ache of no response. We are creatures of reflection. We learn who we are through the echo of others. So when the echo stops, the self begins to falter. Was I wrong? Was that too much? Did I just ruin the intimacy I'd spent years constructing? These questions aren't neurotic, they are ancient. Evolution didn't teach us to be brave. It taught us to belong. So every bold act, every forward step into a fuller version of the self risks severing the primal bond that says you are safe because you are familiar. Barad would point out that this isn't just a personal experience, it's a relational event. Your emergence affects the field pushes back. Not because it's malicious, but because it's structured for equilibrium, and your expansion is a disturbance, your voice is a tremor, your new boundary is an architectural shift. The cost of becoming is paid not in effort, but in consequence. What changes when you change? That's the real question. And too often we pretend that success is just about effort, when really it's about consequence management. Arendt's notion of natality, beginning something new, requires stepping into a world where your action has no guarantee. You begin not because it is safe, but because the alternative is a kind of living death. To deny your own evolution is to consent to erasure. Not erasure by force, but by gradual self-abandonment. You dim, you delay, you explain, and in doing so you keep the old ecosystem stable. But at what cost? What version of you is being evicted every time you prioritize harmony over honesty? So if you feel alone right now, not in the isolated sense, but in the I just did something real and no one knows what to do with me sense, that is not proof you're on the wrong path. That is the weather of transformation. Learn to stay with it, because on the other side of that silence is not applause, but alignment, not consensus, but coherence. You've probably been told that success means finally arriving, being seen, heard, understood. But what if it begins with being misunderstood? What if the path to coherence runs through a corridor of distortion? Not because you're unclear, but because others are still calibrated to your former frequency. You've changed, but their ears are still tuned to who you used to be. And in that lag, in that dissonance, something brutal but necessary occurs. You realize that growth doesn't just make you more visible, it makes you unrecognizable. Jung would call this the tension of opposites, the push and pull between your emerging self and the image others have frozen in place. And that image, it wasn't born of malice, it was born of need. Others needed you to be a certain way to feel whole. And now, as you evolve, that wholeness threatens to fracture. Their discomfort isn't your fault. But if you still believe that your job is to regulate the emotional climate around you, you'll start to shrink just enough to avoid becoming the storm. Barad would remind us, identity is not a fixed essence. It's a diffraction pattern, a series of interactions shaped by context. You're not breaking your identity, you're changing the aperture through which it comes into view. That's not betrayal, that's ontology. And yet, the world doesn't easily accommodate this. Most social structures prefer stability over truth. They want the known version of you, even if it's an old lie. Because that lie fits. It fits the family mythos, the friendship choreography, the workplace hierarchy. It fits the mirror others have built using your still image as its frame. Arndt's vision of the political self insists on appearance, not as performance, but as participation in a shared reality. To appear is to claim space. To speak is to risk irreversibility. You don't get to take it back. That's what makes becoming so terrifying. Not just that you'll be seen differently, but that there's no undo button. And so the temptation is to edit in real time, to water down the truth, to soften the shift, to retranslate yourself in the dialect of the past. But translation is a kind of denial when the source material has evolved. To keep explaining yourself to people who are committed to not understanding you is a spiritual violence. It slows the soul, it bruises the voice. It suggests that your becoming is only valid if it's palatable, and this is the moment you must choose. Will you calibrate your expansion to the comfort of others, or will you let your growth set its own frequency, even if it means being momentarily unrecognized by the ones who once knew you best? The body remembers who it had to be. Before the first success, before the first risk, there was strategy, shaped in silence, refined through compromise. A shoulder turned inward to seem smaller, a voice softened not for elegance but for safety. These weren't choices, they were calibrations, micro-adjustments that helped you survive a room that couldn't hold your full shape. And now, as you begin to fill that shape, to inhabit what was once only imagined, the body doesn't celebrate, it recoils, it hesitates, not because it doubts your potential, but because it still associates your truth with danger. Jung might call this a neurosis, but not in the pejorative sense, in the protective sense, a signal flare from the unconscious that something once buried is about to surface. The fear isn't failure, it's exposure. Success, real success, doesn't just raise your profile, it reveals your internal architecture. It says, this is how I think, how I see, what I care about, and that revelation feels like standing naked in a room full of dressed expectations. It's not just vulnerable, it's radical. Barad would argue that the body is not separate from its knowing, that sensation, memory, and perception are entangled. You don't have an instinct, you are an entanglement of historical, relational, and material forces. So when your throat tightens before you speak your ambition, that's not anxiety, that's ancestral data. That's your lineage brushing against the limits of what it was allowed to want. The past doesn't just whisper in your head, it pulses through your ribcage, it flares in your breath, it shapes the tempo of your dreams. Arndt, ever focused on action, might say that this is where courage lives, not in the absence of fear, but in the presence of risk without guarantee. She knew that to act is to begin something whose outcome cannot be known in advance. And yet, you act. Not because you're sure, but because staying silent would betray something deeper. Not just the idea of who you could become, but the quiet promise you made to yourself when no one was watching. The promise to try. So here you are. The dream is no longer abstract, it's an invitation. And your body, your brilliant, hesitant, memory-laced body, isn't sure if it's safe. That's not failure, that's realism. The kind of realism that says, becoming isn't just about breaking through. It's about reconditioning every part of you that once equated expansion with exile. And that takes time. Not because you're weak, but because you're whole. And whole things take time to rearrange. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This episode was digitally narrated by Holly, who helps bring our ideas to life. And thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. They help us reach more people like you.